welcome. Uta is an Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Development at UCL, the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. She has been involved in autism research for around 5 decades, which is just truly remarkable, starting out when the condition was almost hardly understood or known. And she continues to be endlessly fascinated and passionate about understanding the causes, the contributions to autism, its diagnostic criteria, and so on. And indeed, the human mind more generally. So we're tremendously privileged to have Uta come and speak to us today. She's a true pioneer in the field of autism research, which she's going to tell us more about. So thank you again, Uta.
Thank you, Christine. It's always absolute pleasure to be here, and I feel we're so welcome, so thank you. Thank you also for coming. So we're talking about a topic which I hope will provoke you to more discussion, something that has been sort of brewing up, this crisis. So only last week, almost by coincidence, I got this message from the British Association for Autism, Autistica UK, in my inbox, and read what it says. Over 187,000 await diagnosis, a system in crisis. The latest figures, as you can see from NHS England, show that as of June 2024, nearly 190,000 people were waiting for autism assessment. If these people formed a queue, they would stretch from London to Brighton, just to visualize this. They also say the waiting time for autism assessments trebled in the past 3 years, contributing to a growing crisis in which some autistic people and families are forced to wait years for diagnosis. And they also add that 2/3 of those waiting are under 18. We don't know whether that includes young children, and we don't know, of course, how all the other ones are that are over 18. But autism is not an exception in this increase, because we know there is an alarming increase in mental health conditions of all kinds, not just in autism. So in ADHD, in all disorders of anxiety, in post-traumatic stress disorders, in mood disorders. And it seems that, at least in the UK, amongst young people where we have some reliable statistical data, the rates of probable disorder in all of these conditions increased from 10% in 2017 to 18% in 2020. So this is statistically very significant. The latest data, I believe, are saying it's 23%, so perhaps it is relatively stable now. But let's look just at autism spectrum conditions and the prevalence in children. And luckily, we can rely on some very good database that's provided by the Center for Disease Monitoring and Control in the US. This is based on 11 centers geographically distributed over the states. It's very well controlled, very reliable data, and they concentrate just on 8-year-olds in their particular geographical areas. So what we can see is that the prevalence of autism is actually very variable according to the geographic position. So it's on average 2.8% of 8-year-olds that are diagnosed with autism in 2023, so very recent data. But in California, it's 4.5%. In Denmark, there's been a very good project, also quite recently in 2020, where the prevalence is put at 1.27% of that sort of age group. I found some data for Sweden, just teenage boys, and that seems really quite high, percentage of 4.1%, and only boys registered with ASD. Now, as you know, there is a ratio of 4 boys to 1 girl diagnosed on average, but it does seem now that this ratio is decreasing, and it's sort of 3 to 1 at the moment, that recognizing that perhaps girls have been overlooked. But what we are interested in at the moment, what is this crisis, this increase in prevalence over time? Now, this monitoring network in the US reported 1.6% on average for 8-year-olds of autism diagnosis in 2000. And in 2023, 2.8%, as I've already said. So this is a very significant rise, and still we need to bear in mind there is this geographic variation. Autism is now so common that everyone really has heard of it, and that actually there are many ways of trying to signal autism. So I remember a time when parents wanted to hide their children and not admit to having autism in the family. This has really, really changed. There is this increasing awareness. There is thankfully a real decrease in stigmatization. We all know that, for example, the earphones, the ear defenders are a kind of signal. When we see somebody, you know, on the tram or somewhere like that, we can say, oh, there's probably an autistic person. We should take care. We should not expect them to behave just like everybody else. And of course, there are lots of stickers that are being used saying, you won't necessarily see me as different or as autistic, but please be patient with me. I'm not misbehaving. I have autism. I'm autistic, and proudly, and also. Now, here is an interesting study done in the UK, which talks of the rise of autism spectrum conditions over 20 years, precisely 1998 to 2018. And this used the database from GP records, so all records in the whole country. And the GPs have, registered whether a person has this diagnosis of ASD. And you could really look over time and see this amazing, this really dramatic rise. And in fact, they also say there's a 787% increase of recorded incidence of diagnosis between 1998 and 2018. And now we should look behind this increase, because it changed according to the age at which diagnosis was carried out. So you find many more cases, rising cases over time in people older than 19 years old, while the young children, the 0 to 5 years, the sort of classic, first early diagnosis, is not a very steep increase at all. And another really strong tendency was seen that it's the diagnosis of females that has really taken off over the years. So this is what we need to remember when we talk about the rising prevalence of autism. It's not overall, it's quite specific. And what hasn't increased, which I think is really important to take note, is what's now often called profound autism. That would be sort of classic cases. There has been a slight increase in this, probably due to greater awareness of the condition. But what has absolutely hugely increased is the case of mild autism or high-functioning autism. So that is very important, again, to bear in mind when we're talking about the increases in the prevalence. Now, of course, there are some really quite very obvious reasons for increases over time. And that you could say is to do with changes in diagnostic criteria and reporting practice. There was an excellent Danish study, people here at Aarhus carried it out, was published in 2015, comparing prevalence of children born between 1980 and 1991, and they showed that changes in diagnostic criteria and in reporting practices accounted for 60% of the increases in cases. But of course, what we have to ask is, why did the diagnostic criteria change? So let's have a quick look at the current diagnostic criteria. And you probably know that there are these two kind of Bibles used as manuals by people who make diagnosis. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual in the US, the latest version from 2013, so of course they're working on the next one now, and ICD-10, which is World Health Organization, which is a very recent edition. Now what I was struck by is that they both actually agree very remarkably in putting down the two key features of autism. So persistent deficits in reciprocal social interaction and communication, and a range of restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. There have been changes that are traced specifically in the DSM-5, so they have included for the first time sensory abnormalities, which was not mentioned in previous editions, and it isn't actually mentioned in ICD-10, as far as I know. So these are quite subtle changes, but we need to look a little bit more into this, and I looked at what the APA, American Psychological Association website says about diagnosis of ASD, and what counts as communication deficits. Now, I'm not going to read out this list, but you can see that they're all incredibly vague and to some extent subjective ideas as to what you have to look for if you make a clinical diagnosis. But what's really more concerning is that we don't know whether these kinds of problems, like aversion to maintaining eye contact or interpreting abstract ideas literally, whether to what extent they are perfectly found in the neurotypical population. We don't know whether any of this is really specifically to do with autism. So it's very non-specific, and all of these things, like, say aversion to maintaining eye contact, could be originating perhaps from severe social anxiety, not necessarily from autism. Now, let's look at the restricted repetitive behaviors. And I think you will find, if you look at all of these examples, like including sensory hypersensitivity, aversion to loud noises, you have to ask yourself, isn't this quite common maybe in neurotypical children too? We have absolutely no data on this. So this seems a very shaky foundation, in fact, for making the diagnosis. And you really can see how people might be sort of lulled into a false sense of security because they've got these checklists. They can say, yes, that is the case. Somebody told them that the child or the adult that they're looking at does like to arrange things in a particular manner, maybe on their table, well, for example, and that will count towards a diagnosis of autism. And of course, this is particularly bad for research that's now often done remotely, based on web-based recruitment, where people say, well, we found so many people diagnosed on a questionnaire with autistic symptoms such as these, whether they have them or not. And well, it is very worrying as to what validity we can ascribe to these kinds of studies. Now, there have been many warnings about using checklists and subjective reports, and in particular, Fonbonne has been trying to warn about this change in diagnosis, so that people not only use these questionnaires that are sort of self-administered, but even the so-called gold standard instruments like the ADOS, where you observe behavior and you think you could do that 100% reliably, etc. You need lots of training in order to even administer the test. Even when you use ADOS in Canada in autism centers, presumably where it is kind of to alleviate the pressure on the health service so that people will get the diagnosis. Now, as you can see, that in collecting 232 cases who had been diagnosed using ADOS on these centers, and then taken them to the clinic at McGill University, where an absolutely thorough assessment was made by very experienced clinicians using all sorts of information. Only half of these cases actually were then thought to meet the criteria for autism. So this is very, very important. And as Fonbonne says, counting abnormal behaviors without establishing their specific autistic quality and nature is a source of over-diagnosis. Now, let's go back to that alarming message from Autistica UK. So if there are 187,000 people who await diagnosis, and even if there is some pre-existing diagnosis or self-diagnosis, should we now assume that 93,000 of these also are likely to be false alarms? Worry unnecessarily about their status. Could be. But still we have to say that another, roughly 93,000 cases might be true, and they are waiting to be identified, and it often is a very anxious wait. So we can't get, of course, go around this fact that there has been an increase as suggested by current data of this monitoring network, and we need to look at the causes for this. And of course there are many different causes. We have to assume at the moment our best estimate as to causes of autism are that there are genetic factors there. And of course they always work in context, they never work just on their own. They don't happen in a vacuum, so they're complex interactions with other biological factors, with some chance events. You know that basically twin research has given this a good foundation where you can compare autism diagnosis in identical twins and autism diagnosis in non-identical twins, and the genetic load is very, very high. So in the identical twins, the shared autism diagnosis was 80 to 90%, and in the non-identical twins only about 20%, which is sort of similar to siblings in general, which is still quite high. So there is some idea of heritability as well as some ideas of de novo mutations. But what about non-genetic factors? And there are vast numbers of studies currently being done, constantly searching for possible reasons for this increase in the incidence. And here are some of the suggested factors, like advanced parental age, exposure to air pollution, to pesticides during pregnancy, and various maternal conditions, with particular interest in immune disorders, premature births, low birth weight. All of these factors seem to be associated with some increase in prevalence of autism. And of course, there are also economic factors, like, is there access to services so that we get even, a proper idea of the actual prevalence. But I'm always worrying about, these papers, whatever next, anything that has changed from last century to this could be, in principle, investigated. And I was just wondering, when will somebody say climate change? I'm sure somebody already said iPhones and social media and all of these things. And we have to remember correlation is not causation. So, what we have to remember, and this is why I put this slide up again, we saw it before, we have to explain separately the rise in the milder end of the autism spectrum. And we don't have to worry much about a rise at cases of autism with, profound autism, which very often goes with intellectual impairment. So all of these factors that are listed here, if they find some positive effects, and they often do very much go together with intellectual impairment, autism intellectual impairment, well, they might explain a little bit that small rise. But they really don't tell us very much about the actual huge increase at the milder end. Now, we now have to really look at other factors for the increase. And I think we have to look at cultural factors. There have been changes in cultural perception. These are changes that could explain huge range in late diagnosis, in adulthood, in girls in particular, and in milder or high-functioning cases. At the same time, relative stability of early diagnosis in the more severe cases. Now, what sort of things have changed over the last 50 years or so in cultural perception? So there has been certainly an increase in the appreciation of diversity, a very strong will towards inclusion and removing stigma. So rather than hiding mental disorder, it is actually okay to say, I have this. We have, of course, in the last 30 years or so, the neurodiversity concept, which embraces inclusion and diversity. There is hugely increased information in different media, and the possibility of self-diagnosis through, go to the websites and you could just say, I think I might be autistic, and you will find probably, if you think you are, you probably, if you fill in the questionnaires, you probably then can say you are. And then, of course, there is more awareness of hidden impairments, and that applies to the girls and women, because they may have been overlooked. I mean, it's always been a puzzle. It's a continuing puzzle why there are so many boys diagnosed as autistic and not so many girls. And there's no really satisfactory explanation. So it is quite reasonable to assume that they just have not been recognized. Perhaps girls are too compliant and sort of vanish in the ordinary population, and you don't see them. So that's been a tendency, and as I've already said, the 4-to-1 ratio is now decreased to 3-to-1. But another factor, really an important one, I think, is that autism has actually managed to attract a very attractive image in fiction. And this would be really applying just to these very mild, very high functioning cases. So on the on media, in fiction, we see autistic protagonists. I just pulled out a few, but there are many, many more. We have Saga Noreen from The Bridge, Astrid Nielsen, Berlin, Paris. There is worldwide. There are different sort of television series and programs that highlight people with really superior intelligence, a logical mind, people who are totally honest and in a sense socially very naive. And at the same time, these people you have very, very high vulnerability, they're hypersensitive, and you could see there are kind of ideas that might have been borrowed from earlier times when people talked about neurasthenia or neurosis in exceptional, very artistic people in the end of the 19th century. Now, I think the popularity of autism spectrum has reached astounding heights in books and movies. In fact, I tried to look up how many such treatments there are, but the Autism Research Institute mentions around 40 movies and TV shows currently available and recommended by that institute. I think it probably all started with Rain Man in 1988, but this protagonist was far more impaired than the recent protagonists. And there have been other subtle changes that are now in the behavior, which, and I think I've heard that some autism organizations really don't like Rain Man anymore. They think that's not really quite what they would like to project. So these are cultural changes, and we need to speculate why they happened at all. Now, in the past, I think autism was widely seen as an individual medical tragedy. And people like me have done a lot of work trying to find out what kind of deficits, for example, in theory of mind, could explain these very severe symptoms. And the theory of mind hypothesis explained very specifically difficulties in reciprocal interaction and in communication. Now, in all of these milder cases in this fictional arena, they completely query and reject this theory of mind deficit. So recent studies have shown high-functioning autistic people are pro-social, they're really skilled at seeing others' perspectives. In fact, they have no communication or social deficit. And the idea of a deficit in anything has been queried. And of course, this is the underlying assumption of the neurodiversity movement. So rather than assuming, for example, that an autistic person struggles to find a job and it's a result of their own shortcoming, they don't get one, you should really consider external explanations that people haven't got the right environment ready to employ autistic people. Now, interestingly, we have this proud person here who is diagnosed at 45, and you can also see there highlighted sensory issues, nothing about social communication difficulties. I don't believe that this particular person, who looks very happy and prosperous, could have had a lot of problems with social communication to get there where he is, and yet he was diagnosed. Now, very often it is actually parents of diagnosed autistic children where there is often great difficulty, where we no doubt that this is a profound case. Parents of these people were usually very successful never had difficulties really until they got their autistic child. And they are the ones who often come forward and say, yes, I have these symptoms too. I have obsessive tendencies. I am hypersensitive. I'm socially not good. I'm actually really, inept and sometimes anxious. Now, interestingly, we have, at the moment, as far as I know, there is no study at all that says something about what these people actually were like as children. They usually find a kind of anecdote which says, well, when I was a child, I was extremely obsessive. Well, many children are, as you know. We all have these games where you have to count things and hopscotch and all of that kind of thing. But all I'm saying is that this is a new phenomenon. This is very different from what a more a clinical approach to autism was like, where the idea that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that you notice from early childhood that stays lifelong was really core of the assumption. So this is very, very different. However, I am extremely interested in this broader autism phenotype, which means, families with autistic children, when they look at parents, when they look at relatives, they will find similar features, but in a very mild form. They're not clinically in need of particular support or help. It is very interesting, and I would love more research to be done about that. But of course, there are many people who have these kinds of signs and symptoms and don't have autistic children. In fact, there's been this study in... Oh, what happened? It's coming on.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, okay, this is a study that use the AQ, the Autism Questionnaire. You're all familiar with that. If not, just you can look it up everywhere. And you can answer questions, for example, I prefer to do things with others rather than on my own. If you say yes, you're not very autistic. If you say no, you get the point. I prefer to do things the same way over and over again. If you say yes, points towards autism. I find it hard to understand jokes or sarcasm. Well, another point towards autism. Are we there yet? Not quite.
Yes.
So you can, you accumulate points towards being autistic or not, as the case may be, and if you get 32 points or more, you are considered to be really, really highly at risk of getting a diagnosis if you wanted one, if you wanted to go to a particular centre. Or you might all forget about it and say, well, clearly I am autistic. And this study, here we are, that's the point 32, where, totally arbitrary cut-off point, where people believe that the likelihood of autism is very high. You can see data separately for mothers and fathers. It doesn't really matter which is which. You can see the different colors. This is the control group. They are families without autistic children, and you see sort of almost normal distribution with a few outliers, people who are on that scale pretty sort of autistic-like, I would say, but that's normal variation. On the other hand, you have the group of parents, again, mothers and fathers separated, who have an autistic child or more, and you get a much bigger tail end after this point of 32. You can see that. Now, some criticism could be made in saying, well, these parents are very, very biased towards seeing themselves like their child. It's very difficult. You would have really liked to have done this before they had children, and then after they had children. Now, we have self-diagnosis a lot using this questionnaire, and of course other means like paying a lot of money, going to a centre. And I found one I thought really quite interesting piece written by a journalist, Emma Camp, and she wrote in the New York Times last year about being diagnosed autistic, first self-diagnosed and then officially diagnosed. And you can see what she says. She was very proud at first. She said it was the condition became part of her identity, and it crystallized her self-concept. She found it was wonderful to be together with other like individuals, and it was addictive for her. And she also enjoyed looking at the influences on social media showing off the attractive elements of the condition. So she says, I quote here, what makes people be drawn to mental health disorder diagnosis? Giving those in certain historically disfavored groups special authority to comment on issues affecting their community. That's really a big plus. This brand of identity politics creates a perverse incentive to collect as many disadvantaged boxes as possible. For those who might otherwise have little cachet under this politics, an identity-defining mental health label offers a claim to oppression. And what was once a dry medical label is now what makes one worthy. Now, 3 years after the diagnosis, which is when she wrote this piece in the New York Times, she said that ambivalence about this ASD label actually had set in. She no longer feels that it's a relevant part of her self-concept, even though she admits she has the same idiosyncrasies as before. And she also claims that making identity revolve around a neurological condition felt very limiting. Now, it would be so interesting to know why and when beliefs change, like about mental health conditions. Now, again, there is a very broad interest in why beliefs change, and the view from behavioral economics is quite clear that belief change is an economic transaction. So you have internal gains from a changed concept of autism spectrum condition, less stigma, biological explanation of your probably complex problems, an entitlement to support. You benefit from the cultural change of meaning of vulnerability and victimhood, and you can have a hint of genius when you think of all these wonderful fictional prototypes. Now, a label gives meaning to common insecurities. If you are socially inept, well, it could be autism. It gives you some kind of quick relief from many anxieties central to teenage and young adult life, people who often will say, is something wrong with me? Is this normal? And depending on what they read, they can answer this. But I think there is one major unwanted consequence, and that is that the conditions might be taken less seriously. So, of course, there are also external gains in getting a different, a change in the autism percept. If you get a diagnosis, you get special concessions, often during exams or in work. You can demand quiet room, low light, sensory spaces, and so on. So this is the economic view. But there is also another very interesting view due to Ian Hacking, and this is known as looping. Looping is a mechanism that explains changing perception, and Hacking started off with explaining the case of multiple personality. Now, in 1957, there was this very famous film called The Three Faces of Eve, which was a fictional representation of multiple personality. And the idea is that this film influenced both the clinicians and the general public. And after seeing this, there was an amazing rise in cases of multiple personality. And then it sank back again. Now, as Ian Hacking says, a new classification may bring into being a new kind of person, conceived of and experienced as a way to be a person. So actually I try to find some data about whether multiple personality is common now or what's going on, but I find it, all I found it is a very controversial topic, and there are clinics who claim there's like, 1 to 2% of the population would have the disorder, and that particular clinic who says so, will cure it or will treat it. Now, that what you will. But we want to look at how looping works in the case of autism. And it's very interesting that the labeling multiple personality brings it into existence, possibly because it really wasn't there before. It never existed before. Nobody thought of it. Did that actually happen with autism? And Ian Hacking says the answer is yes and no. So it's not true, and I think it's absolutely not true, because before the 1940s, autism really existed. We have historical cases. The label wasn't there, but the description of the condition is so clear-cut that we cannot fail but saying, yes, that, as we would now call it autism, the neurological disorder did exist. But then he says, yes, because, it did bring it into existence because it was not a way to be a person. And this is interesting. Now, he also says that before 1975, high-functioning autism, or Asperger's syndrome, as it was then called, existed, but it was not a way to be a person. And today, it is. So there is something very interesting that we know high-functioning people did exist before, but they weren't recognized in the sense that they could really live that experience. So, according to Hacking, it's the very high-functioning, very verbal autistic people themselves who started changing the concept. And one of the most famous ones of these is Temple Grandin, which Hacking quotes a lot. And new concepts, classifications give rise to new social realities as other people recognize themselves in new ways, they form new identities, new attitudes, and then these changes loop back to create changed realities. Now, looping is actually a way, a good explanation for increased prevalence, because the broadened concept of the spectrum, which was inevitable, given this feedback from experience of people who felt they are that kind of person. And this creates a new kind of offering an identity to be described to self and others. More people receive the diagnosis and adopt this label as part of their self-concept. Some of them write about their subjective experiences. These writings influence the clinicians and the researchers, and they are now highlighting symptoms like sensory issues that were not highlighted very much before. So cultural beliefs penetrate into individual minds, and then more people desire the diagnosis. So that's the accounting for increased prevalence specifically of the mild cases and not of the other cases. Now the question is this all spiraling out of control? Do we have to do something about it? We did apparently get from definite underdiagnosis of certain conditions like autism to overdiagnosis. And I really recommend this paper by Lucy Folks and colleagues, just recently appeared, New Ideas in Psychology, where they also use that looping idea. They say first we have raising awareness, but we also label distress, which is an everyday experience, as a mental health problem. There we get an increase in symptoms that are felt and reported based on an over-interpretation of distress. and the discussion of mental health problems is brave and admirable, so you get further efforts at awareness and you get an increase in prevalence. So this is sort of like a self-fulfilling process. Some individuals will have very, very mild symptoms, but they still report them as part of a mental disorder. It's their experience distress, for example, which will then affect their self-concept and their behavior. Now, another, not at all exclusive, an alternative way, which works probably together with the looping effect, is concept creep, which is an idea introduced by the psychologist Nick Hallam in 2016. Now, he says obviously something happened to the concept of mental disorder in general that stretches it to make the diagnosis more common at the milder end, definitely the case for autism. And concept creep, which we could also call, perhaps by a more neutral term, inflation, concept inflation, explains why these many milder cases are now included. Now, there are also political strategies that he talks about that actually have to do with being a minority, fighting for minorities, establishing victimhood. So as you can see, this is very much to do with the idea that harm-related concepts are the ones that are expanded. And he believes that our society has become more sensitive to harm than ever before. This is, sociologists will find out about this, whether it's true or not. But I'm showing you here a kind of schema that he has. And he uses, in fact, very interestingly, the concept of bullying. He claims that in 1970 it was very explicitly distinguished from general peer aggression. It meant direct, intentional, repeated aggressive behavior where the perpetrator was more powerful than the victim. Today, bullying is different. None of these requirements are there anymore. You can also include in bullying acts of omission. For example, shunning a person. That wasn't part of the original concept. So he certainly says there is rising harm sensitivity, and why should that be? Because there's actually risk has diminished. He also talks about motivated harm inflation. So there are what he calls entrepreneurs that on social media incite the feeling that certain things are very harmful when previously they were not considered so harmful. He thinks that there is this widening horizontally and vertical bleaching, so that other conditions are suddenly put together. So this is, in case you are interested, something that could be applied to autism. But I really now want to talk about, and I'm coming near the end, neurodiversity as a concept and the idea of inclusion. We do have not only, I think, this increased sensitivity to harm, but we really have embraced these virtues of equity and fairness and harm avoidance. So many people, for example, Fletcher Watson in 1922 says, humans vary in their neurological makeup, and this variability dictates the ways in which we process information, and therefore our experiences and responses to the world. These differences are thought of in terms of dimensional variability in individuals, but also drivers of clusters or neurotypes mapping onto the dimensions. So the people who are the most common neurotype are often described as neurotypical, and other groups overlapping with diagnostic categories such as ADHD and autism and Tourette syndrome and so on may be referred to as neurominorities or neurodivergent. But crucially, all neurotypes while not equally common, are equally normal. Everything is normal. So my concern here is that why could it be that neurotypicals are such a majority? Don't you think that could be shrinking, and they could suddenly identify with problems that cause their suffering, so anxiety and depression. So it could also become a neuro minority. Everybody will suddenly be a victim. And who are the people who are doing the adjusting accordingly? Now, the hallmark, I suppose, of the neurodiversity movement is they talk about a difference and not a deficit. So there is definitely a conflict between people who endorse neurodiversity and a continuum still want a medical label. That is very paradoxical. They deny, on the whole, the most neurodiversity activists, people, that there are problems. There are, for example, theory of mind or empathy problems. Instead, they claim there is a double empathy problem, and I will talk about that in a moment. And also, campaigners demand that others accommodate, mindful that suffering is invisible by camouflage. And again, I have various concerns, so that really what we are getting here is a lack of balance between adaptation to the environment, of the environment to the person, over accommodating of the person to the environment. Right, now let's talk about double empathy. What is this? Basically, it's saying there is no deficit, let's agree on that. We just don't understand each other. So the idea is, yeah, you call it theory of mind deficit, but I can't understand you, you can't understand me. It's a comforting meme. It's really exceedingly popular in cases diagnosed in adulthood and mild end of the spectrum. And it's really part of this mantra saying we don't need fixing, it's the world that needs to change. And the selling point is, of course, getting away from seeking the cause of the breakdown in the brain of an autistic individual, putting it onto some external societal basis. But I think the double empathy problem could all be part of the in-group, out-group distinction. We always identify with our own in-group. We have often hostility and disdain of the out-group. There is evidence that autistic children certainly form in-group, out-group stereotypes and, you know, flock together, as it were. Although empirical testing has rarely been done, it is clear that autistic people do not better understand, for example, non-verbal expressions from other autistic people than they understand non-verbal expressions from neurotypical people. So there are one or two studies that are all very negative about this double empathy problem. Camouflage, quickly. So this means, and I use this quote, I want to fit in, but I don't want to change myself fundamentally. So it's a cover explanation for late diagnosis and good everyday functioning. And it really relies on this idea that they're suffering deep down. It's not visible to others, but I would say, what about anxiety, exhaustion, and all other things that might be part of your everyday problems, which you might now say are actually an effect of masking. Concern I have is, you know, camouflage, where does it end? Don't we all do it a bit? But it is still an open question how we would even measure it, because at the moment it's just if you say you camouflage, that's the measure of it, then you are. Now, I think all of this is very difficult because it's in danger of trivializing autism. So it's creating a victim identity, it's creating entitlement, it's also flooding mental health, social services, and I think there might eventually be resentment from the shrinking group of neurotypical people. Now, I think the most important negative consequence is that autistic individuals who cannot live on their own, need lifetime support are in danger of becoming invisible. So what can we do about this? I think we need to put now a spotlight on intellectual disability, which hasn't happened for a very long time. Intellectual disability needs to be assessed because absolutely critical for deciding about educational provisions. If you have autism and intellectual disability, you really are very likely to need this extensive lifelong support. There are some data about incidence. I mean, IQ below 70 with poor everyday functioning, in other words, autism, is what is now called intellectual disability, is present in 38% of autistic children. And of course, the proportion has become smaller with the rise of the prevalence of the milder cases. And historically, it was more like 70 to 75% who were estimated to have this intellectual disability. Now, it's not the case that all the others are, geniuses, because 24% have an IQ of a sort of borderline range, and only 38%, even with this inflation of highly intelligent people, have an IQ of over 85 or above. Now, I'm really because I'm over time, I only very briefly show you results of a rather new study by Denisova, who looked at an enormous database, 8,000 infants, who were all part of NIH-funded autism research. So they're all tested and diagnosed at the age of 2 to 4, but they've been tested on the Munsell scales, which is an IQ test, early on. And you see at age 10 months, 20 months, 30 months, and so on. And the diagnosis of autism or not autism is shown here in green and in red. And you can see the divergence even from those children who happen to have been tested incredibly early in life on this test, have a lower IQ than the others, and they diverge as they are tested when they're older. And of course, the results are much more reliable. So a young child with a low IQ taken at random from the study sample is 40% more likely to be later diagnosed with autism than children in that same sample who have average or above IQ. Now, there is another approach which I should mention to help with this crisis, and that's known as the transdiagnostic approach. Interestingly, this really asks for abandoning labels and categories and to explain variability and complexity of symptoms and behavior in general in multi-dimensional space. And it relies on a continuum of measurable behavior, it rejects discrete categories, it establishes individual needs, and will find support accordingly. So this is a very useful approach, but I think it's still early days, because at the moment my concern is that it's very atheoretical, because how do you decide which symptoms to measure and to focus on? Do you just use what's available? And is that not quite arbitrary? You take tests like working memory or executive functions, but maybe you should do something else. You should invent new tests. Now, I think a concept creep suggests a reset of everything. Maybe this will help us overcome this crisis, but we should really continue debating what is normal and what is abnormal in mental health. Not just reject the idea that everything is that anything could be abnormal, but face it more head on, see what is the difference. Continue the value of categories and dimensions both. Continue refining and reviewing the diagnostic criteria. Invent new, more precise labels for perhaps stable personality differences, which could be autistic-like. And I think be aware of looping, limit what is now called participatory research, because that is the direct influence of this particular population that will say that's what autism is my own experience, which is very subjective and may not be what we want in unbiased research. So I think new labels for clinical categories need to be attractive, and they have to always consider strengths as well as difficulties. So I think a crisis is not necessarily a bad thing, because it makes us to get to work on better ideas. I think experts absolutely need to critique the changes and offer alternatives. At least today I have tried to critique the changes and be quite outspoken in some of the criticisms that are a little bit taboo for most researchers, because they do not want to mess up their relationship with the autism community and suggest that it's okay to talk about deficits. That's a really quite controversial thing. Now, we should continue to find out whether we really need more categories rather than less, making up more people, maybe imaginary phenotypes, just to see what the counterfactuals would tell us about how far we could go and how autism would fit in. I would say it would be very useful to do more really detailed, classic, single case studies to find out how symptoms change with age, for example. And of course, we do need to encourage the study of this broader phenotype or the autistic-like personalities. I think it's most intriguing that this is sort of lurking around. Thank you for your attention.